Out of the vestibule, no. Don't put your hand on that brake wheel. You'll grind your filth into iron that real trainmen have to trust on the mountain. And the last thing this run needs in a blizzard is your stink worked into the steel. Your lost baggage. Old woman, you're the unclaimed trunk nobody comes for. The bag we drag off at the end of the line and throw on the heap in the back of the depot because there's no name on it worth keeping. That's what you are on my train. That's all you've ever been. And don't stand there working your jaw at me like there's a syllable in it I need. With a mountain grade coming up, I've watched a dozen of you rattle out the end of your years on these cars. Soot-cured old-timers with a lantern and a brake club. Thinking that because you tapped wheels and set handbrakes for 30 winters that makes you railroad. It doesn't. The woman who checks the brakes is not the one who runs the train. The car attendant is a porter who learned which end of a wrench to hold. A step above the man who sweeps the coaches, and a step below the conductor's watch chain. You crawled along the running boards in the cold, tightening what the real men told you to tighten. And that whole rattling, frostbit, little life, is exactly where your part of this ends. The train is mine to run tonight. The passengers are mine. The call on whether we take the grade is mine. Mine and the railroads that pinned this badge on me. You're the attendant. You're the baggage nobody claimed. So pick up your lantern and your wrench and shuffle back to the baggage car with the rest of the freight. Before my crew comes through and has to look at you standing in my vestibule like you forgot you're the dead weight. Not the train man. And the woman he was saying all of this to, Augusta Lyle. 68 years old. Standing in the swaying vestibule between two coaches of the night, express at 11:10, as the train climbed toward the high pass. The blizzard slamming white against the door glass. A brakeman's lantern in one hand, and a worn brake wrench hanging from her belt, did not step back out of the vestibule. She did not argue. She looked at the man for a long, quiet moment. The floor lurching under them both as the cars took a curve. And then she tipped her head toward the floor, toward the trucks and the brakes underneath. And she said, very evenly, the brakes on the last 3 cars aren't holding the way they should. And the temperature's dropping fast enough that the airline's going to freeze in the rear of the train before we crest the pass. I walked the cars and bled the reservoirs an hour ago. There's water in the system back there. And water in an air brake on a night this cold means ice. And ice means those rear cars lose their brakes. You take this train over the top and down the far side of the pass, the long grade. The one with the curves above the gorge with the back third of your train not braking. And the cars that can't hold will shove the ones that can. And you'll lose the whole train down the mountain in the dark. That's why I'm in your vestibule. I came to tell you to stop at the summit and bleed and dry that line before we start down. That was all. Not you can't talk to me like that. Not I'll wire the division. Just the thing she'd come to say. The thing she'd found out on the running boards in the cold with her own hands and lantern, while the man who called her lost baggage rode warm in the head-end coach. The man saying all of it was named Pierce Holloway. And he was 36 years old. And he was the conductor of the night express, the one with the watch and the bell cord, and the authority over whether the train moved or stood. And somewhere in his climb, from ticket taker to the conductor's blue serge and brass buttons, he had decided that the only way to feel like he commanded a train was to make certain that somebody in his cars always felt like she didn't belong on it at all. He had a tick when his authority felt thin. He'd pull the heavy railroad watch from his vest pocket on its chain and snap the case open and shut. Click-clack. Then drop it back, the way some men touch a badge to feel the weight of who they think they are. He did it now. Click-clack. And he ignored. Completely. Every word Augusta had just said about the brakes and the freezing line. Because a wheel-tapping car attendant did not get to tell the conductor whether the train could take the grade. To understand how Augusta Lyle came to be standing in that vestibule in the storm with a lantern and a warning nobody wanted, you have to back up a long way. And you have to understand from the very start that there is no secret here. Augusta was not secretly wealthy. She was not a retired railroad president in disguise. She had no powerful relative about to step out of a private car and set everything right. And there is no twist coming where the old attendant turns out to own the line. She was exactly what Pierce took her for. At a glance, a black woman in a railroad coat with a wrench on her belt who had spent her life crawling the cars in the cold so that other people could ride warm. And the whole point of what happened that night is that being exactly that was already enough. Was already a person worth listening to. Long before anyone with brass buttons came through the train. We save our listening for after the reveal. We wait to find out somebody matters before we grant them the simple dignity of being heard. But water freezing in a brake line on a mountain grade does not wait for a reveal. And neither does the truth. It was true when the woman sang it was just the car attendant. It was always true. And the mountain, which has killed more confident men than almost anything that runs on rails, has never once cared about a person's badge when it decided whether to let a train down its grade or take it into the gorge. Augusta Lyle had worked the mountain division for 43 years. And that flat-term car attendant undersells what she actually was. The way the help undersells most people who get called it. She had started at 25, in an era and a region that did not make it easy for a woman, let alone a black woman, to get near the running gear of a railroad at all. And she had gotten near it anyway. The slow, hard way. Starting by cleaning coaches and tending stoves, and then, because she had a feel for machinery and a stubbornness that outlasted the men who tried to keep her off it. Working her way to the air brakes and the trucks and the wheels, it had cost her. Getting there. The men in the terminal had not wanted her. And they had said so. In every way men say so, the jobs she was not given. The tools that went missing when she needed them. The things written on the wall of the place she had to wash off herself. The conductors who would not call her by name. The years she did the work twice as well to be counted half as much. She had been called every name there was, long before Pierce Holloway was born, to add lost baggage to the list. And she had outlasted all of it. Not by fighting it head-on, which would have gotten her fired in a week, but the way Eckford Calloway taught her by being, undeniably, the one whose hands kept the trains coming down safe, so that even the men who hated that she was there could not finally do without her. It was a brutal way to earn a place, and it should not have been necessary. And the fact that it was necessary is part of what this story is about. But she had earned it that way because that was the only way there was. And by the time she was old, she had become the thing the old heads spoke of. The inspector you didn't argue with. And the names had mostly stopped. Mostly until a new young man with a new badge looked at her in a vestibule and reached the way the untrained and the frightened always reach for the oldest and easiest weapon there is, which is to tell a person who has earned everything that she is nothing. Over 4 decades she had done every cold, jolting, dangerous job the cars had. She had coupled and uncoupled in the dark, set and released handbrakes on grades that would frighten a younger person. Walked the tops of moving cars in the days when you still did that. Bled the reservoirs and tapped the wheels for the cracked ring. That means a wheel is about to fail. And for the last 30 years, she had been the senior car attendant and air brake inspector on the night. Runs over the mountain, the person responsible. On every climb and every descent, for the one system that everything else depended on. The brakes that had to hold a train of steel and souls back against the pull of a mountain grade. That is the thing the passengers dozing in the warm coaches never think about. Never have to know that a train going down a mountain is a falling weight held back only by air and iron. That the air brakes that hold it are a delicate thing of compressed air and valves and reservoirs that must be kept dry and warm and true. and that the whole difference between a train that glides down the grade and a train that runs away into the gorge is whether someone walks the cars in the cold and keeps the brakes honest. Augusta had walked those cars 10,000 nights. She had bled the lines and tapped the wheels and set the retainers through 43 winters. And in all that time, by the reckoning of every old conductor and engineer who had since retired or died, Augusta Lyle had never once let a train start down the grade with a brake fault she had found and not fixed, and had more than once held a train on a summit, over the loud objection of a conductor in a hurry, until a frozen line she didn't trust was thawed and bled and proven. End quote. But the old conductors, who had known what a brake inspector was worth, were gone now, retired or carried off by the years. And the new ones, the men like Pierce Holloway, who had come up through the passenger service and the timetables and the on-time bonuses, who measured a run by whether it made its schedule, they did not know Augusta the way the old ones had. They saw an old woman with a wrench, a relic of the rough old hands-on days, a position the railroad's accountants kept eyeing now that the new cars had better systems and the company wanted to cut the old crew slots. They did not know that the old woman with the wrench could read a brake system in the cold dark better than any gauge in the cab, that she could tell by the hiss of a bleeding reservoir, and the feel of a brake shoe, and the sound of a wheel under her hammer, exactly what was sound and what was failing, that she carried in her body 4 decades of how this specific mountain and this specific cold worked on a train, how the airlines gathered water, how the water froze on the long climb, how the rear of a train always ran colder and lost its brakes first. They did not know, because they had never asked. The way you never ask, the people you have already decided are beneath asking. And here's the thing you have to understand about a woman who has kept the brakes of one mountain division for 43 years. The thing that is the whole quiet engine of this story. She knows the grade the way you know the breathing of your own child in the next room. She knows that a train is not a thing that stops because you wish it to, but a tremendous falling weight that must be actively, mechanically held back every foot of a descent, and that the holding is done by air, compressed air running the length of the train through a line that links every car's brakes, so that one failure anywhere can starve the rest. She knows that the great enemy of an air brake in winter is water. That moisture collects in the reservoirs and the line. And that on a hard climb into hard cold, it freezes. And that a frozen airline does not warn you politely. It simply means that when the engineer calls for the brakes on the way down, the cars beyond the ice do not answer. And a train that thinks it has full braking discovers halfway down a grade that it has a third of it. She knows that the rear of a train runs coldest and freezes first, and that the cars that lose their brakes do not just fail to slow themselves, they push. Their dead weight shoving the cars ahead, overpowering the brakes that still work, so that the failure of the few becomes the runaway of the whole. She knows that a runaway on the long grade above the gorge does not end in a gentle coast. To a stop, it ends in speed. No curve can hold. And the curve above the gorge, and the dark, and the river far below. She knows it not from a manual, but from 43 years, and from the wrecks the old men told her about, and the one she saw with her own eyes as a young woman, a runaway on this very grade. The cars piled in the gorge, the lanterns of the search going down the rocks in the dark, the way some railroaders carry scripture. She knows the smaller truths, too. The 10,000 particular things that live only in a body that has done one work in one place for 4 decades. She knows that this grade gathers its cold in the last hour before midnight, that the rear of a train on this climb runs a good 10 degrees colder than the head end where the locomotive's heat drifts back, that the third car from the rear has always been the first to ice because of how its reservoir sits low and shadowed under the frame. She knows the particular dead-flat thud of a cracked wheel against the clear ring of a sound one. and the particular wet catch at the tail of a bleed that means water and not just damp, and the particular long-drawn hiss of a line that's dry and honest. She knows which couplers run rough in the cold and which retainer valves stick and which brake shoes wear fast on the curves above the gorge. She knows the sound a train makes coming down a grade properly held. A low, steady working sound. And she knows God, help her. She has heard it once. The other sound. The rising wrong scream of weight beginning to win. And she has spent 43 years making sure she never hears it a second time. None of this is written anywhere. None of it was in any examination Pierce Holloway passed to earn his badge. All of it lived in the body of the woman he called lost baggage. Put there one cold night at a time across 4 decades. And not 1 ounce of it could be replaced by a signed paper, or a schedule, or a man's certainty that he outranked her. And she knows. Above all, the thing the new conductors with their timetables and their bonuses have not learned, that the mountain does not care about the schedule, and the grade does not care about the on-time record. And the only thing that has ever stood between a train full of sleeping people and the gorge is whether somebody who truly knows the brakes walks the cars and keeps them honest, and whether anyone with the authority to hold the train will listen when she says we cannot start down. Pierce Holloway knew almost none of this. He had been made conductor of the night express only that season. Promoted up out of the day coaches by a division that liked his on-time numbers and his way with the better class of passenger. Young and ambitious and certain. The first conductor on the mountain run in memory, who had never once walked the cars in a blizzard with the brake inspector to learn what she was feeling for. He knew timetables and tariffs and the seating in the parlor car. He did not know the brakes, not how the water gathered and froze, not how the rear cars went cold first, not how a frozen line turned a full train into a third of a train at the worst possible moment the way Augusta did, the way you only can, by walking one mountain's cars for 43 years. And on a blizzard night, when the express was already running late behind the weather and his new conductor's record and his shot at a better run depended on bringing this train in on time, the very last thing Pierce Holloway wanted to hear was that he had to stop at the summit and lose half an hour bleeding a brake line. Least of all from the car attendant, the railroad was already talking about cutting. That was the real situation underneath. The railroad, squeezed by the new highways taking its passengers, had been cutting crews and chasing its on-time record as the one thing it could still sell. And Pierce had been handed the night express with the clear understanding that the way up in this railroad now was to run on time no matter the weather. He was ambitious. He was scared. In the way men get scared when their whole future rides on a number and a storm is eating their schedule alive. And he had buried that fear under a hard certainty that the old, slow, hands-on caution, the wheel tapping, the line bleeding. The summit stops was exactly the obsolete drag that was sinking the railroad, and would sink his career with it if he indulged it. He had decided in his first weeks on the run that the old brake inspector's careful walking of the cars was the superstition of a woman who couldn't accept that her kind of railroading was finished. He had staked his standing on bringing the express in on time through anything. And now, with the grade coming up and the storm screaming, the old woman with the lantern was telling him to stop the train. And here is the trap Pierce had built for himself without ever seeing it. The trap so many people in charge build. He had staked his whole young future on the things he could see and weigh from the warm head-end coach, the timetable. The on-time sheet. The brakes signed off down in the Valley Terminal. The superintendent who read the schedule every morning, and he had no way to set all that visible. Pressing, career-shaped certainty against the one thing he couldn't see. Because seeing it took 43 winters of hands on the running gear, water turning to ice in a line in the rear of a train, climbing into a cold no thermometer in his coach could feel. So when the seen thing a schedule, a record, a paper, signed, warm, and dry, collided with the unseen thing, water freezing in the dark. At the back of the train, Pierce reached automatically for the one he could see. Because it was the only one that felt real to him. That is the whole mechanism of it. Not evil. Just a man who ran the train from the warm coach colliding with a danger that only lived out on the freezing running boards beyond his knowledge. And trusting the wrong one. Because the right one came out of a mouth he'd trained himself not to hear. The most dangerous thing on that whole mountain, the night of the blizzard, was not the ice. It was a conductor who could only believe what he could see from where he sat warm, and what he could see did not reach back to the rear cars, where the line was freezing, or down the far side to the curve above the gorge, where a train full of sleeping people would learn what he'd decided. And the cruelty of it, the particular cruelty of that era and that railroad and 1,000 workplaces like it before and since, was that the system had been built deliberately to make Pierce's blindness feel like competence. The railroad was dying, slowly, killed by the highways taking its passengers. And in its long decline, it had reached for the one thing a dying institution always reaches for: numbers it could show. On-time performance, cars per crew, minutes saved, and it had taught its young men that the way up was to make those numbers move. And it had quietly taught them, too, that the people who slowed the numbers, the careful ones, the old ones, the ones who said, wait, the ones in the railroad coats who walked the cars in the cold, were the enemy of the numbers, and therefore the enemy of the railroad's survival, and therefore expendable, cuttable, lost baggage. The system did not say this in words. It said it in promotions and pink slips, in whose caution got rewarded and whose got punished. In the on-time sheet, the superintendent read every morning, and the inspector's slot the accountants kept circling. Pierce Holloway had not invented his contempt for Augusta Lyle. He had been carefully, institutionally trained into it. The way a whole generation of managers everywhere is trained to mistake the people who keep the things safe for the people who keep the things slow. That is why these nights keep happening, on railroads and shop floors and everywhere else. It is not that men are born believing the old woman in the cold is dead weight. It is that we build systems that pay them to believe it, and then act surprised at the edge of the gorge. Augusta had found the trouble on her walk an hour before. She had a habit, 43 years deep, of walking the whole train end to end on a hard climb in hard cold. Because she knew in her bones that a climb into a blizzard was exactly when the air system gathered and froze its water. It was not a comfortable walk, and it never had been. To walk a moving train end to end in a blizzard on a mountain climb is to pass from the warm lit world of the coaches, where people doze and read and trust, out through vestibule after vestibule into the cold and the lurch and the howl, and then out onto the running boards, along the cars where the wind tries to take you, and the iron is slick with ice, and the gorge waits somewhere below in the dark. And to do it not once, but the length of a long train, lantern in your teeth, bare hands on frozen valves, because you cannot read a bleed through a glove. Augusta had done it 10,000 times, and her body at 68 knew every yard of it and protested every yard of it. The cold biting into the old brakes and the swollen knuckles. The climb of it, leaving her breath short in the thin, high air. She passed through the warm cars on her way back, and the passengers who noticed her at all saw only an old woman in a railroad coat moving through with a lantern, going about some menial thing, and looked back to their books. Not one of them imagined that she was the reason they would see morning. That was the walk. She made it anyway. Every hard climb, every hard cold, because the young ones didn't make it the way it needed making, and a frozen rear line did not announce itself to anyone warm. And tonight, in the worst cold of the winter, she had walked back through the swaying cars to the rear of the train and gone out onto the icy running boards with her lantern. And at the reservoirs of the last 3 cars, she had cracked the bleed valves the way she had 10,000 times. And instead of a clean hiss of dry air, she had heard the sputter and seen the spit of water in the air moisture in the system. A lot of it. The rear reservoirs wet, and the line beyond them wet, and the temperature dropping so fast that she could feel the night turning the wet metal to ice under her hands even as she worked. The rear of the train was going cold and wet, and a cold, wet airline on the way up, a pass is a frozen airline on the way down. And a frozen airline on the way down meant the last 3 cars would have no brakes on the long grade above the gorge. It was not a maybe. It was a clock. And the clock was running. So Augusta had done what 43 years told her to do. She had come forward through the train, car by car in the cold, to find the conductor and tell him. The express had to stop at the summit where the grade leveled, and there was time and safety to do it, and bleed the rear airline dry and warm, and prove the brakes on the last 3 cars, before the train started down the far side. Half an hour, maybe, on the summit. But half an hour that had to happen before a single wheel started down the grade above the gorge. She had tried once already, by the train phone in the rear vestibule. Before she came forward, she had rung the head end and reported the wet line and the freezing rear brakes and her recommendation to hold at the summit and bleed the system. Plain and clear. And the voice that came back was Pierce's, from the warm head end coach. And Pierce had said the brakes had been tested and signed off at the division terminal, and he wasn't going to lose half an hour on the summit and blow an already late schedule because the car woman thinks she feels ice coming, and that she should log it and tend your stoves, and let me run my train. And hung the phone up. So Augusta had walked forward through the lurching cars to the vestibule outside his coach to say it to his face. Because some things are too important to leave on a train phone with a man who doesn't want to hear them. And a train full of sleeping people about to start down a mountain on failing brakes is one of those things. It is not that I think I feel ice coming, Mr. Holloway, Augusta said, because she had decided she was going to say the whole thing, even if it cost her the last of a 43-year working life. It's that I cracked the bleed valves on the last 3 cars an hour ago and got water. Not air. There's moisture all through the rear of the system. And the glass is dropping faster than I've seen it drop in years. And water in an airline in this cold is ice inside the hour. Those brakes were signed off at the terminal. Yes, down in the valley, where it was warmer and the line was dry. The climb and the cold have changed everything since. And nobody's hands have been on those reservoirs since, but mine. When the engineer calls for the brakes coming down the far side, the last 3 cars are going to have ice in the line where the air should be. And they will not brake. And dead cars don't just fail to slow, they push. 3 cars of dead weight, shoving the cars ahead, will overpower the brakes that are still good. And we will lose this train down the grade above the gorge in the dark. Stop at the summit. Give me half an hour to bleed that line dry and thaw it and prove the rear brakes. And then we start down safe. And we come in late. But we come in half an hour. That's all I'm asking. Hold the train at the top. Pierce snapped the watch open and shut. Click, clack. Listen to the mouth on this one, he said. Not really to Augusta. More to the swaying coach. To the storm against the glass. To whatever invisible audience men like him perform their certainty for 43 years tapping wheels, and you still think anybody up here is waiting on your feeling about a brake line. I've got a train that's already 40 minutes down behind this weather. I've got a division superintendent who reads the on-time sheet every morning, and a railroad that's cutting runs that can't make their times. I've got a parlor car full of people who paid for the express because it's the fast train. and a schedule that says we crest that pass and we come down the other side and we make up time on the grade, not lose another half hour sitting on the summit. And you want me to stop this train on the top of the mountain in a blizzard and lose 30 minutes because you bled a valve and got some water and have a feeling about ice? He laughed. Short and hard. I didn't say I have a feeling. I said I cracked the valves and got water. That's not a feeling. That's a thing that came out of your train into my hand. Oh, into your hand. Pierce stepped closer in the swaying vestibule, and his voice dropped into something quieter and meaner. The voice men use when they mean to put a thing in its place for good. Let me tell you something, old woman, since clearly nobody on this railroad ever has. You see this train? Steel and brass and a fortune in equipment. A name on the timetable people plan their lives around. Real railroading, run by men who came up through the service, who took the conductor's examination, who the company trusts with the watch and the pouch and the lives. People earn the blue surge. And you came onto this railroad 40 years ago because a section hand got himself killed and left you with nothing. And they handed you a coal scoop out of pity. And you've spent your whole life crawling the running boards in the cold, tightening what your betters told you to tighten. And somewhere along the way you got the idea that putting your hands on the brakes makes you a trainman. It doesn't. You're a porter with a wrench. You are the last person on this entire train whose say-so should be touching my schedule. And the fact that you walked the whole length of my train to tell me. With the badge on my chest, whether we take the grade, tells me you've forgotten your place so completely that somebody ought to remind you of it for good. That's not me being cruel. That's the kindest thing anybody's told you in years. You're lost baggage. Lyle. Dead weight. Know it. Before the mountain teaches you, Augusta took it. She stood in the freezing, lurching vestibule, and took the whole thing. The way she had taken 43 years of it. And when he was done, she said, quietly, "You finished?" "What?" I asked if you were finished. Because none of that got the water out of your brake line. The car rocked. The storm clawed the glass. You can tell me my place from here to the bottom of the grade. Mr. Holloway, the water in that rear line doesn't take orders from your badge. It's sitting in the reservoirs of your last 3 cars right now. Freezing a little harder every foot we climb. And not one word of your speech about what I am has thought a drop of it. You can fire me. And it freezes. You can put me off at the next stop. And it freezes. And then the engineer calls for the brakes on the curve above the gorge and finds out the way the crew on that freight found out 40 years ago. That he's got a third of a train. I didn't walk up here to be a trainman in your eyes. I walked up here because there's ice forming under a train full of sleeping people. You can talk about my place. Or you can let me bleed the line. The mountain doesn't care which you pick, but it's going to care a great deal. On the far side of the pass. What you decided. That was when Pierce made it final. You know what holding this train another half hour on the summit does to a schedule that's already 40 minutes down? No. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back through the train. You're going to tend your stoves and mind your passengers like the job you've actually got. And this train is going to take the grade on schedule. Because the brakes were tested and signed at the terminal and the paperwork's in the conductor's pouch. And if I hear one more word out of you about holding my train on that summit, you can hang up that lantern and not come back to this division. Because you'll be done. 43 years. Finished. Over a cup of water, you say. You bled. That's how sure I am. Now go, tend your stoves or get out of my sight. There it was. Threatened with the end of 43 years on the mountain. At 11:10 on a blizzard night. For being right. And here is the moment Augusta almost went back through the train and let it go. People think it's pride that keeps a person standing their ground. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes pride is the voice that says, go back. Tend your stoves. Let the man take the grade and learn the mountain the way the mountain teaches. You rang it up on the phone and you walked the whole train forward to say it to his face. You've done more than the railroad pays any attendant to do. Augusta was 68 years old. The cold got into her hands now, the way it never had at 40. The knuckles swollen and slow from 4 decades of frozen iron. And the walking of the cars on a climb was harder every winter. And she had a daughter down in the Valley City named Roberta, who'd been after her for 3 years to come off the night runs and take the spare room and a warm life while her body still let her enjoy one. And for one long breath she thought, "Fine, fine, take your grade, Mr. Holloway." I rang it up and I walked the train to say it to your face. And a woman my age can only stand in a freezing vestibule being called lost baggage by a boy who's never bled an airline a single cold night in his life. She even turned. She put her hand on the vestibule door to go back through the train and tend her stoves, and let the man have his schedule. The storm howling against the glass. And as she turned, the door of the coach swung open with the lurch of the car, and she looked through it down the length of the lit aisle at the passengers. The whole car of them, dozing and reading and rocking with the train in the warm yellow light, and she stopped, because she could see them, not as the passengers, not as a parlor car manifest, but as people, a whole train of them strung out behind her through car after car into the cold rear where the brakes were freezing. Ordinary people riding through a blizzard night, trusting the train to carry them over the mountain and down the far side and home. An old man asleep with his hat over his eyes. A young soldier in uniform, going somewhere or coming home. A woman with a basket on her lap, knitting in the lurching light, and 3 rows down, a mother young, tired, traveling alone with 2 small children asleep against her. A girl of about 6 and a boy of about 4. The boy's head in her lap and the girl curled into her side. The 3 of them rocking together with the motion of the train. The children deep in the trusting sleep of children who believe the grown-ups have the night in hand. And those cars? Those children were strung out toward the rear of the train where the airline was turning to ice. And Augusta Lyle understood. The way you understand a thing in your chest before your head can argue with it. That this whole train of people, that mother, those 2 sleeping children, every soul in every car was going to be aboard when the engineer called for the brakes on the far side of the pass, and a third of the train did not answer, and that she could not go back and tend her stoves and let it happen. No matter what Pierce Holloway called her, no matter whose name was on the conductor's pouch. The passengers didn't do anything. That mother and those 2 babies asleep in the swaying light were the only thing that mattered on this whole roaring mountain. A woman who has kept the brakes of this grade honest for 43 years does not go back and tend her stoves while the train starts down on ice. She turned back around. "No," she said, quietly, under the storm. "You can end my 43 years. Mr. Holloway, you've got the watch and the badge. That's yours to do. But I am not going to go back and tend my stoves while you take a train full of people down the grade above the gorge on a frozen rear line. This car of people right here. That mother and her 2 babies 3 rows down. Every soul strung out back to the cold cars where the brakes are icing as we speak. So fire me. Take the 43 years. But this train holds at the summit until that rear line's bled and thawed and proven. And right now, the only person on this entire train who knows those brakes are freezing and how to make them safe is the one you just called lost baggage. So you go ahead and put me off this division by morning, Mr. Holloway. But you'll be standing right here explaining to a board of inquiry and to a whole valley of the bereaved Why you took the grade after the inspector who's kept this mountain's brakes for 43 years told you the rear line was freezing with that mother and her 2 sleeping children aboard the cars that couldn't stop. And she did not go back through the train. She set her lantern down on the vestibule floor where the man could see it and put her cold hand on the brake wheel. The very wheel he'd told her not to touch. The manual handbrake that was the last thing standing between a dead car and a runaway. And Pierce Holloway stood in the lurching vestibule with his watch in his fist, genuinely unsure for the first time all night. Because a woman who was bluffing did not lay her hand on the handbrake. A woman who was bluffing did not get ready to fight the mountain herself. She went back through the train and tended her stoves and let it be. What happened over the next stretch happened against the clock. Because a mountain grade does not wait. And the pressure of that clock is its own kind of point. So I'm going to slow it down to tell it. You take your hand off that brake wheel, Pierce said, his voice gone hard and low, stepping into the vestibule after her. You don't touch the running gear of this train without an order from the conductor. You're done. Lyle, you're terminated. Off this division at the next stop. The train takes the grade as scheduled. You can terminate me, Augusta said, her hand staying on the iron. But terminating me doesn't thaw the line. You can put me off at the next stop. And the water's still freezing in the rear reservoirs. And the last 3 cars are still going to lose their brakes on the way down, whether my name's on the crew sheet or not. The only thing that saves these people is somebody bleeding and thawing that line before we start down. And that's not a thing your badge can do, or your watch, or your on-time sheet. That's a thing one person on this train knows how to do. And you just terminated her. And the ice is forming exactly as fast as it was a minute ago. She nodded down at the floor, toward the trucks and the brakes under the swaying car. You don't have to believe me. Walk back to the last car with me right now and crack a bleed valve yourself. And tell me you get clean air and not water and not the first skin of ice already starting in the valve. It's a 2-minute walk. I'll go first with the lantern. Because that line doesn't care what you call me. Mr. Holloway. It's freezing. That's just true. You can terminate the woman who bled it. You can't terminate the ice. It was you can't terminate the ice that stopped Pierce cold. Because some animal part of him, the part that had ridden enough winter grades to have felt, once or twice, the long, cold second of a train, not slowing quite as fast as it should understood, all at once, that the woman was right about the one thing that mattered. A badge could not thaw a line. The watch could not dry a reservoir. His authority over 43 years of this woman's life could not melt 1 inch of ice in the rear of the train. Everything Pierce had, the blue serge, the brass buttons, the watch on its chain, the brakes signed off in the Warm Valley terminal before the climb, and the cold had changed everything, was suddenly worth exactly nothing against water, turning to ice on a mountain. And the only currency that meant anything in that vestibule on that night was a kind of knowledge Pierce Holloway did not have, and had spent his whole short tenure as conductor deciding he didn't need. And then a third voice came into the vestibule, the head-end brakeman. A steady man in his 40s named Dunmore, who had worked the mountain a long time and had come back through to see why the conductor and the car attendant were standing in the cold. He took it in Augusta's hand on the brake wheel. The conductor's color up, the storm at the glass, and he said, carefully, because you do not lightly cross a conductor on his own train. Mr. Holloway, if Gussie says there's water in the rear line, there's water in the rear line. I've worked this grade with her 20 years. I have never once gone down this mountain on brakes, she flagged. The old heads on this division used to say it if Gussie Lyle says hold the train. You hold the train. And you don't ask her twice if you want to see the bottom of the grade. If she bled those reservoirs and got water. In this cold before the long grade. He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. He looked down at the floor, toward the brakes. and a low, cold understanding went through the vestibule. Because Dunmore knew exactly what a frozen rear line meant on the grade above the gorge. And a conductor can override a car attendant, but it is a far harder thing to override his own brakeman and the memory of every old head on the division at once. It is worth saying plainly. Here, while the train climbs and the matter hangs, what was really being fought over in that vestibule? Because it was not really the brakes. The brakes were simple. The brakes were physics. And the physics was not in doubt. Water freezes, ice blocks, air. A train without rear brakes runs away on a grade. Any engineer on the division would have told you the same. What was being fought over was something older and harder than physics. Whether a man with a badge could let himself be saved by a woman he had decided was beneath him. That is the real grade every one of these nights climbs. The one steeper than any mountain, because to take Augusta's warning was not, for Pierce, merely to accept a fact about brakes. It was to accept that the whole order he had built his young life on, the order in which the conductor knew and the car attendant tended, in which the blue serge meant competence and the railroad coat meant labor, in which he was above and she was below, was wrong, was exactly backwards, on the one question that mattered most that night. It was to accept that the most important person on his train was the one he'd been treating as the least. Most men cannot do that, not because they are wicked, but because the self they have built cannot survive the admission. And they would, at some level, they would never say aloud. Rather risk the train than dismantle the self. That is what kills people. Far more than ice ever has not malice, but a man's need to keep being who he thought he was. Right up to the edge of the gorge. And the rare thing, the thing this whole story turns on, the thing rarer than any reveal, is a man who, at the last moment, lets that self come apart rather than let the train go down. Pierce did not know yet whether he was that man. Neither did Augusta. The climb went on, and the cold gathered in the rear, and the question hung unanswered in the freezing air between them. Now, while the train climbs toward the summit and the conductor stands frozen between his pride and his brakeman's plain words, let me tell you how Augusta Lyle came to be, the woman in that vestibule, because you cannot understand why she would not go back and tend her stoves unless you understand what was built into her. And by whom? Across 43 winters, she had come to the mountain at 25 with nothing but a strong back and a dead husband and a daughter to feed. Her husband, Ilias, had been a railroad man himself, a section hand on the flat division down in the valley, and he had been killed the way too many of them were in those years, between two cars in a yard on a wet night. And the railroad had given Augusta a small sum and a smaller apology, and the understanding that a widow was the railroad's problem only until the check cleared. She had a baby girl, Roberta, 8 months old, and she had taken the only work the railroad would give a black woman in that time and place, which was cleaning the coaches and tending the coal stoves that heated the old cars. At the bottom of the mountain terminal, for wages that barely kept the two of them, she had loved Elias, and the way he died had marked her in a way that shaped everything after. He had been killed between two cars in a yard at night, coupling in the wet dark, and a careless move up the train. A slack run-in, nobody warned him about, and he was gone between one breath and the next. A strong young man with a wife and a baby. Gone, because somewhere a signal wasn't given, and somebody didn't take the half-minute to make sure the man down between the cars was clear. It was not a break that killed Elias, but it was the same thing that killed everyone the railroad killed in those years and the years before. Somebody in a hurry, somebody who didn't take the small, careful moment, somebody who decided the schedule mattered more than the man in the dark, doing the dangerous work nobody watched. Augusta had stood at his grave with a baby on her hip and understood, young as she was, that the railroad ran on the bodies of people it considered beneath its noticing, and that the only thing that ever changed that, ever, was somebody refusing to be in a hurry, somebody taking the half minute, somebody deciding that the man in the dark mattered as much as the time. She did not know yet that she would spend her life being that somebody, but it was planted in her at that grave, the thing Eckford Calloway would later teach her hands to do, that the whole war, the entire war, was between the schedule and the person in the dark, and that she had already chosen her side the day they buried Elias, and she might have stayed there, at the bottom, cleaning and stoking, a line on the railroad's ledger, and nothing more. Except for an old man named Calloway. Eckford Calloway was the senior airbrake inspector on the Mountain Division then. An old black man who had been on the railroad since before anyone could remember, who had come up in an even harder time than Augusta's and had earned, by sheer, undeniable mastery of the one thing the mountain could not do without, a grudging permanence. The railroad could not quite bring itself to end. He was the man the old conductors meant when they said, "You didn't take the grade on brakes." A certain inspector had flagged, and Eckford Calloway, watching a young widow stoke stoves in the terminal with a baby asleep in a basket in the warming room, saw something in the way. She watched the men work. The running gear saw her eyes following the wrenches and the valves, saw her not flinch from the cold or the iron, and did the thing that the old hands did then and that hardly anyone does now. He took her on. He taught her. Augusta could close her eyes 43 years later, standing in that vestibule with her hand on the brake wheel, and be 26 again, out on the running boards of a string of cold cars in the terminal yard before dawn. Eckford Calloway's big scarred hands guiding her young ones to the bleed valve. No. Daughter, don't just crack it and listen for a second and close it back. Crack it and stand there. Let it run. What's it telling you? Air. It's just air. It's air now. Stand there longer. Air. Air. Air, and then? And the young woman had crouched there in the cold and the dark, the valve hissing under her hand, until at the tail end of the hiss had come a faint sputter, a wet catch in the sound. There's water in it. There's always a little water in it. The question is, how much, and how cold, and how far up the mountain you're going. That's the whole job, daughter, not the wrench. Anybody can turn a wrench. The job is knowing how much water in, and how cold, and what that water's going to do at the top of the grade when it's 20 below and the line's full of it, and the engineer calls for the brakes coming down the far side. He'd taken her hand off the valve. Gentle. You're going to spend your life out here in the cold and the dark where nobody can see you. And every train that comes down this mountain safe is going to come down because somebody bled the lines and tapped the wheels, and nobody on it will ever learn your name. They'll ride down warm and never think of you once. And here's the part you've got to carry. Daughter. Because they'll try to grind it out of you. Being who you are and being where you are, you're going to be tempted. Some bitter night. To think that because nobody sees you, it doesn't matter. That you can crack the valve and listen for a second and close it back and go get warm and let the next person worry about the grade. Don't you ever? You stand there and you let it run and you read what's really in the line and you tell the truth about it. Even when a man with a watch and a badge tells you you're wrong and tells you what you are. Because a whole train of people who will never know your name are trusting their lives to whether you stood there long enough to hear the water. That's the job. That's the whole of it. Everything else is just turning the wrench. He had taught her for years. The slow, patient way. Against the resistance of every man in the terminal who did not think a woman, and least of all a black woman, belonged anywhere near the running gear of a train. He had stood between her and the worst of it when he could. And when he could not, he had taught her to stand it herself, to do the work so undeniably well that the truth in her hands outlasted the contempt in their mouths. "They'll call you everything but a child of God," he told her once. "And the only answer that ever shuts them up is a train that comes down the mountain safe because of you. Be that answer. Be it so many times they run out of names to call you." And she had been that answer. 10,000 times. Over 43 years. And they had never quite run out of names. There was always a new Pierce Holloway with a new word. Lost baggage this time. Sawdust or slag or rack or chum or silt or ash, some other time and place. But the trains came down safe. And that had been her answer. All her life. The only one that ever mattered. There was one more thing Eckford Calloway gave her. And it was the reason, more than any other, that Augusta Lyle would never in her life crack a valve and close it back without standing there to hear the water. And it was not a lesson, but a night. It happened in her third winter on the railroad, when she was still learning. Still mostly stoves and coaches. Allowed near the brakes, only under Eckford's eye. There had been a freight that came down the mountain on a night much like this one. A night of hard cold after a wet day. And the inspector on duty, not Eckford, who was off that night, but a younger man in a hurry. A man the conductor liked because he never held a train, had cracked the rear valves and listened for a second and closed them back and signed the train down the grade. And somewhere on the long grade above the gorge, exactly where Augusta had warned Pierce the danger lived, the rear of that freight had lost its brakes to ice. And the dead cars had shoved the live ones. And the train had run away. Augusta had been at the Summit Terminal that night, stoking the stoves in the operator's shack. And she had heard it happen the way the mountain lets you hear such things. The rising, wrong, runaway scream of a train going down a grade far too fast. A sound no railroader ever forgets, and every railroader knows the instant they hear it. The sound of weight winning, and then the silence. And then, much later, the lanterns of the search going down into the gorge in the dark. Small and swinging. Down and down the black rocks toward the river. Looking for the cars and the men who had been in them. 2 men had died on that grade that night. A head-in crew who never had a chance once the weight took them. And Augusta, 28 years old. A stove stoker, the railroad barely counted, had stood at the door of the shack and watched the lanterns go down into the gorge, and understood, in her body, in a way no lesson could ever have taught her, what an airline full of water meant, and what it meant to crack a valve and close it back and not stand there to hear the water. Eckford had found her at the door of the shack in the gray dawn, still watching the gorge, and he had not said anything wise. He had only stood beside her a while and then said, "Now you know why I make you stand there and let it run. That's why, down in the gorge, every time you want to hurry, you remember those lanterns." And she had, for 43 years, every time a conductor told her to hurry, every time a man with a watch called her a name and told her to log it and tend her stoves, she had remembered the lanterns going down into the gorge, and she had stood there and let it run, and heard the water. It was the lanterns she was thinking of now. With her hand on the brake wheel and Pierce Holloway's pride filling the vestibule. Because the grade above the gorge below them in the dark was the same grade. The same gorge. The same long curve where weight wins. And she had decided a long time ago that there would not be a second night of lanterns on her watch. Not while she had hands to bleed a line and a voice to say, "Hold the train." That was the woman Pierce Holloway had called lost baggage. And if it seems impossible that a single old woman in a railroad coat could be so sure, so unwilling to bend, understand that the night of the blizzard was not the first time Augusta Lyle had stood in a vestibule and refused a man with a badge. There had been others. Across 43 years, most of them small, a conductor talked around. A break fixed before it became an argument, but there had been one. 15 years before, that the old heads on the division still spoke of, and it had made her name on the mountain among the people who knew what names were worth. It had been a spring night, not a winter one, and the danger had not been ice, but a wheel. Augusta had been tapping the wheels of a standing passenger train at a division, stop-walking the cars with her hammer, striking each wheel and listening, because a sound wheel rings clear and a cracked one gives back a dull, dead note, and a wheel with a crack ringing through it will, sooner or later, with a train of people on it, let go. And on the third car back, she had struck a wheel and heard the dead note, the flat-lying thud that meant the iron was cracked through somewhere inside where no eye could see it. And the conductor that night, a hard man named Schuyler, long since gone, had not wanted to set out a car and rebuild his train and lose the time on a wheel that looked, to the eye, perfectly whole. He had stood over her with his watch and told her she was hearing things, that the wheel looked fine, that she'd cost him an hour over a hammer tap, that she was a foolish old woman who didn't know a sound wheel from a cracked one. And Augusta had stood there with her hammer and struck the wheel again, and made him listen, made him hear the dead note next to the clear ring of the sound wheel beside it, and said, "You can fire me for the hour, Mr. Schuyler, but you put a train of people over the high trestle on that wheel, and it lets go. And it's not an hour you'll be explaining." And Schuyler, who was hard but not a fool, had heard the dead note and set the car out, and the shop had pulled that wheel and found it cracked clean through the inside of the rim. A wheel that would have failed on the trestle within 100 miles. And Schuyler had never thanked her men like that, but he had never again asked her twice. And he had told the other conductors, in the way the old heads passed such things along, that when Gussie Lyle's hammer found a dead wheel, you set the car out and you didn't argue. Not if you wanted to see the far side of the trestle. That was the reputation the old division had of her. The one the new men like Pierce Holloway had never bothered to learn. Not that she was cautious, but that she was right. Over and over. Across decades. In the specific deadly particulars that no schedule and no signed paper ever caught the cracked wheel. The dragging brake. The frozen line. The small lying things that kill whole trains. 43 years of being right. 10,000 trains brought down safe. And still, on a blizzard night, a man with a new badge could look at her and see only lost baggage. Because being right where no one can see you is the most thankless rightness there is. And the world saves its respect for the people whose value comes with a title attached. Augusta had stopped expecting the respect a long time ago. She had not stopped being right. That was the whole of her. And it was enough. And it had always been enough. On every night the trains came down safe because of it. Back in the vestibule, the train still climbing, the matter still hung in the balance. Augusta's hand on the brake wheel, Dunmore's plain words in the air. Pierce Holloway caught between the badge on his chest and the truth he did not want. And it was then that the door of the coach opened again. And the trouble of a passenger train, which is also its mercy, came into the vestibule in the shape of a small girl. She was the older of the two children Augusta had seen, sleeping against their mother 3 rows down, 6 years old, in a coat too big for her. Her hair in careful plaits her tired mother had done that morning 100 miles ago, and she had woken, the way children do on a train, and gone looking for the washroom, and wandered instead into the cold vestibule full of grown-ups arguing. And she stood there blinking up at them, swaying with the car. One mittened hand on the wall. "Is the train broke?" she asked. In the plain way of a child who has heard the word break and the word broke and not sorted them yet, the man said, "The train is broke." and the vestibule went quiet, all three of them looking at her. And something happened in that quiet that no argument could have done. Because Pierce Holloway looked down at the child, at the too big coat and the careful plaits and the trusting upturned face, asking him, the man with the badge, whether the train was safe and the abstraction he had been defending, the schedule, the on-time sheet, the half hour, the principle that a conductor does not let a car attendant override him. All of it ran up against a 6-year-old in a borrowed coat asking if the train was broke. And the abstraction lost. It does not always lose. That is the whole terrible truth of nights like this one, that the abstraction very often wins. That schedules and pride and the fear of looking weak send trains down grades and crews into chutes and ships onto reefs all the time. And the children are only counted afterward. But sometimes, in some person, at the last moment, the real thing breaks through the abstraction. And a man remembers that the number on his on-time sheet is made of exactly this: a child in a coat too big for her, asking if the train is safe. No, honey, Augusta said, before Pierce could speak, crouching down to the child's level with a knee that did not crouch easily anymore. Her voice gone soft and certain in a way it had not been for the conductor. The train's not broke. We're just making sure it stays not broke before we go down the big hill. That's all. You go on back to your mama and your brother and get warm. And the train will be just fine. I'm going to make sure of it myself. That's my whole job. Making sure of it. And the child looked at her, looked at the old woman with the lantern and the wrench, the one the conductor had called lost baggage, and found in her face the thing children are unerring at finding, which is whether a grown-up is telling the truth and was satisfied, and let Dunmore walk her back through the door toward her mother. But she paused at the door, the way children do, and turned back, and said to Augusta, with the grave directness of the very young, "Are you the one who makes sure?" And Augusta said, "I'm the one who makes sure." And the child nodded, as if that settled the entire night. As if the existence of someone whose whole job was making sure was the most natural and reassuring fact in the world, and went back to her mother and her sleeping brother, and was asleep again herself within minutes. In the trusting, bottomless sleep of a child who has been told by a truthful grown-up that someone is making sure, she would not remember it in the morning. She would not remember it ever would grow up. The girl with the careful plaits. And live a whole life. And never once know that she had stood in a freezing vestibule on a mountain at midnight and asked the most important question there is. Are you the one who makes sure? And been answered yes by the woman who was about to save her life. That is how it goes. The ones who are made sure for do not remember being made sure for. They only get to grow up. And it was that the child's grave nod, "Are you the one who makes sure?" The absolute trust of a 6-year-old that someone in the world is making sure that did to Pierce Holloway what no argument of Augusta's and no plain word of Dunmore's had quite managed to do. Because he had been his whole young striving life. A man trying to be the one in charge. And a child had just shown him, without meaning to, that being in charge and being the one who makes sure are not the same thing, are, in fact, often opposites, and that on this train, on this night, the one in charge was him, with his badge and his watch, and the one who made sure was her, with her lantern and her split hands, and that a 6-year-old could tell the difference at a glance, and had instinctively trusted the right one. In the silence after the child, Pierce Holloway looked at Augusta, crouched there by the brake wheel. And at the door, the little girl had gone through. And something in his face that had been clenched tight for a whole season of chasing his on-time number and proving he belonged in the blue surge came, finally, loose. Now here is where you might expect the turn. The railroad president riding in a private car at the rear. The reveal that Augusta is secretly somebody. The inspector general stepping off at the summit. The comeuppance. None of that happens. That is not what this story is. No one important arrives. Augusta does not turn out to own the line or have a famous name. She turns out to be exactly what she said. She was an old car attendant who knows this mountain's brakes better than anyone alive. And the whole turn, is that Pierce Holloway, with the summit lights coming up ahead in the storm, and his brakeman against him, and a 6-year-old's face still in his mind, finally said the words, "Hold the train." That's the harder truth, the one without a private car. Most people who get called lost baggage are not secret kings. They're just people, carrying knowledge nobody bothered to ask for. And the test of a person isn't whether they listen to the stranger who turns out to be important. It's whether they listen to the one who turns out to be exactly who she appeared to be, because that, and only that, is the real measure. Anyone can heed a woman once they learn she outranks them. It takes a person to heed the car attendant. On a blizzard grade, when there's nothing in it but the children asleep in the cars behind. "Hold the train at the summit," Pierce said. The words came out rough, like they cost him teeth. He turned to Dunmore. "Pass the word to the head end. We stop at the top. Tell the engineer to set the train and hold on the summit. Full air. And bleed nothing without her word." And then, to Augusta, the conductor gone out of his voice. What was left just a man who had nearly done a terrible thing. "Tell me what you need." "The line. The rear cars. The half hour. The whole crew if you want them. I don't know how to do what you're about to do. Just tell me. And it's yours. Make the train safe to take down." And Augusta picked up her lantern. Real talk, those 4 words. Hold the train at the summit, are the whole story. And they're so small you could lose them under the storm. Not the bleeding of the line. Not the train coming down safe. 4 words from a scared, ambitious young conductor with a late train and an on-time sheet and a whole season of trying to prove he belonged in the badge. Because understand what they cost him. Every instinct Pierce had, every rung of his climb, every fear for his record was screaming, "Take the grade." The brakes were signed at the terminal. The old woman's a relic. You'll lose another half hour. And a man who can't keep a schedule doesn't keep the night express. And under that, the uglier thing. A man who has spent his climb deciding the people in the railroad coats are beneath him cannot easily reach down to one of them for rescue. Because the reaching is itself a kind of death to who he thought he was. Pierce almost didn't say it. He said it because his own brakeman stood against him, and a child in a borrowed coat asked if the train was broke, and some last decent frightened thing in him chose. In the final mile before the summit, a train full of sleeping people over his own record. Most people don't. Most people, in that mile, protect the number they've staked themselves on and take the grade. The whole thing turns on a proud man, with the summit lights already showing in the storm, choosing at the last second not to be the worst version of himself. That's rarer than any reveal. And it's the only thing that brought that train down the mountain hole. The summit terminal was little more than a water tank, a coal stage, a telegraph shack, and a long siding scraped out of the rock at the top of the pass. 10,000 feet up, where the air was thin and the cold had teeth, the express ground up the last of the grade and out onto the level of the summit and stood. Brakes set. In the screaming white, the locomotive's headlight boring, a cone of driving snow. And the whole train shuddered and hissed and went, still in a way a moving train never is. and the passengers in the warm cars felt the change and stirred. Some of them, and looked out at the storm and the lonely lights of the shack and wondered why the fast train had stopped on the roof of the world. Augusta did not waste a second of the half hour she had fought for. She was out the rear vestibule and down on the snow-blown ballast before the train had fully stopped breathing. The lantern in her teeth, Dunmore behind her, and a young car attendant named Purnell, the only other crewman who'd ever shown the least interest in the running gear. A man of 30 who'd asked her questions. Other men didn't bother to ask, coming back fast from the head end with the tools and the torch she'd called for. The work was not glamorous, and it was not quick, and it could not be hurried. And that was the whole of it. She started at the rear car and worked forward through the last 3. And at each one, she did what Eckford Calloway had taught her 10,000 mornings ago. She cracked the bleed valves on the reservoirs and the line and stood there in the killing cold and let them run. Let the air run out with its load of water, watching the water spit and freeze on the iron as it came, draining the wet system down. And where the line had already begun to ice, and it had, in 2 places, in the rear car, exactly as she'd known it would. The air passages skinned over with the first glaze that would have become a plug by the bottom of the grade. She and Purnell worked the torch along the frozen sections. Slow and careful. Never too much flame in one place. Thawing the ice out of the line, and then bleeding the melt away before it could refreeze. And then drying the line with fresh air run through it from the head-end compressor. Again and again. Until the valves she cracked at the rear ran clean, a hard, dry hiss with no spit. No catch. No water. The sound Calloway had taught her was the sound of a line you could trust down a mountain. It took the full half hour and more. The passengers waited. The storm screamed. There was a bad moment. Midway. That none of the passengers ever knew about. On the middle of the 3 rear cars, a bleed valve itself had frozen, not just water in the line, but the valve seized, solid in the cold, so that when Augusta went to crack it, the handle would not turn. And for a few seconds, she crouched there in the blizzard, working it and feeling it not give. And that is the kind of moment where a frightened person forces it and snaps the valve and turns a half-hour delay into a crippled car and a real disaster. Purnell, beside her, reached for it with the wrench to force it. And Augusta stopped his hand without looking up. No, son, you force a frozen valve. You break it, and then we're worse off than we started, and we're not going anywhere. You warm it. Patience. Always patience. That's most of this whole trade. The patience to do it slow when everything in you and everybody up, the train is screaming to do it fast. And she cupped her own bare cracked hands around the frozen valve body and had Purnell play the torch low and gentle along the line below it. Never the flame straight on the valve. And they warmed it the slow, careful way until the seized handle gave a 1/4 inch. And then a half. And then turned. And the valve cracked open and ran its water and its air. And the danger of that one passed because 2 people had refused to hurry it. It was a small thing. It was also the whole thing, the entire night, the entire trade. The entire difference between the lanterns going down into the gorge and a train full of people sleeping through the storm was made of exactly that. The patience to do the slow, careful, right thing in the cold while the schedule screamed. 1 frozen valve at a time. Why'd you let me hold the torch? Purnell asked her, low, while the valve ran. You could have done all this faster alone, 'cause somebody's got to know how after me. Augusta said, not looking up from the line. I'm 68. Son, one of these winters I won't be out here. And when I'm not, the water's still going to gather in these lines on the climb. And the rear's still going to freeze first. And there's still going to be a man with a badge who wants to take the grade on schedule. Somebody's got to be out here who'll stand at the valve and hear the water and say no. Might as well be you, since you're the only one who came back through the storm to ask. And Purnell said nothing, but he held the torch a little steadier. And something passed between them out there in the cold that was older than either of them. Older than the railroad. The oldest thing there is the handing down of how to keep the people who come after you alive. The locomotive panted at the head end, holding the train against the level summit with its own brakes, while Augusta made the rest of the train honest. And Pierce Holloway, this is the part that matters. The part that made it a change and not just a near miss. Pierce Holloway did not wait in the warm head-end coach. He came back through the train, out into the cold, and stood on the icy ballast in his blue surge that was made for a parlor car and not a summit blizzard. And he watched. He watched the old woman's swollen hands work the valves and the torch in the cold with a sureness his own hands would never have. He watched her crouch at each reservoir and read the running air the way a doctor reads a pulse, the way he had never in his life read anything that wasn't printed on a schedule. He held the lantern for her when she needed both hands. This conductor holding light for the car attendant he'd called lost baggage an hour before. And somewhere in that half hour in the cold he understood, watching, that the difference between them had never been the badge. It was that one of them went out into the cold and the dark under the train where the truth lived. And one of them rode in the warm car and called the train his. And for the first time since they'd pinned the brass on him, Pierce Holloway felt the blue surge for what it was, not a thing that made him know the train. Just a thing that let him forget he didn't. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked her. Once. Into the cold, holding the lantern while she worked the torch. It came out quieter than anything he'd said all night. 43 winters, Augusta said, not looking up from the line. Started stoking stoves at the bottom of this same mountain with a baby in a basket. Old man named Calloway taught me the brakes. Taught me to stand at the valve and let it run and hear the water. Because the water's what kills you, and it's the one thing that won't show itself any other way. She bled the thawed section. Watched the melt spit and stop. He told me I'd spend my life out here in the cold where nobody could see me. And every train that came down safe would come down because of hands nobody ever thanked. He was right about that. You're the first conductor in 30 years to come out and hold the lantern. Pierce was quiet a moment, the storm tearing at them both. "I called you lost baggage," he said, "an hour before you saved my whole train. You did. And I'd have taken the grade." He made himself say it, watching the dark line of the train curving away into the snow, the warm windows of the cars where the passengers waited. "If you'd gone back and tended your stoves like I told you, I'd have taken her over the top and down the far side. And the rear would have lost its brakes on the curve above the gorge. And I'd never even have understood what was happening. I'd have just felt the train start to run and not slow. And by the time I knew, it'd be the gorge. I'd have lost the whole train. That mother. Those 2 children. Sure, I was making up time the entire way down." He looked at her. "How do you carry that? Knowing how close. You don't carry what didn't happen," Augusta said. "You'd freeze solid inside. A person tried to carry every almost. You carry what you do the next time somebody out of the cold tells you something you don't want to hear. That's the only part you get a say in." She cracked the last valve, and it ran clean. A hard, dry hiss. No water. No catch. And she held it open a long, extra moment the way Calloway had taught her. Listening. Sure. Before she closed it, there. That's the sound. That's a line you can take down a mountain. She straightened up. Her back, telling her about the cold and the years. "Your train's honest now. Mr. Holloway. Rear brakes'll hold all the way down. She'll take the grade and bring these people home." While Augusta worked the rear line and Pierce held the lantern, the train waited on the summit, and the people inside it waited too. And it is worth stopping the clock a moment to walk the cars and see who they were, because the whole weight of what Augusta was doing out in the cold was made of exactly these people. And a train is not a number on an on-time sheet, but a long, warm string of lives strung out across a mountain in the dark. And every one of them was riding home that night on a brake line. An old woman was making honest with her hands. In the rear coach, the one whose reservoirs had iced first, rode the mother and her 2 children. Her name was Della, and she was 27. And she was taking her son and daughter across the mountain to her own mother's house in the Valley City because her marriage had come apart and she had nowhere else to go and not much left but the 2 children sleeping against her. And the fare she'd scraped for 3 tickets on the night train because it was cheaper than the day. She did not know that the cars she rode in had been the ones losing their brakes. She knew only that the train had stopped on the summit and that her daughter had wandered off and come back, saying a nice old lady was making sure the train wasn't broke. And Della had held her children closer in the lurching warmth and been, without knowing why, comforted. She would get to her mother's house. The girl with the careful plaits would grow up. None of them would ever know that their lives had turned. That night, on whether a woman in a railroad coat went back and tended her stoves or stood her ground in a vestibule. That is how it is. With the people whose hands hold the rest of us up, the saved almost never know they were saved. They just go on. They just get to go on. Across the aisle from Della rode the old man asleep with his hat over his eyes, a retired schoolteacher named Hollis, going to his brother's funeral on the far side of the mountain. The last of his family, but for the brother in the coffin. And now, not even him. He had ridden trains his whole life and trusted them the way you trust the ground. And he slept through the summit stop entirely, and woke only when the train started down, and thought nothing of the delay, and lived 11 more years he would not have had, and taught, in those years, a great many more children, none of whom would ever know they'd been taught by a man who'd been saved on a summit, by a brake inspector's stubbornness. In the next car forward rode the young soldier in uniform. His name was Amos, 19, going home on leave to a town in the valley, to a mother who had not seen him in a year, and a girl he meant to marry. He was awake at the summit, his face to the cold glass, watching the storm and the lonely lights of the shack, impatient, the way the young are impatient, with any delay between themselves and the people they love, not knowing that the half hour he chafed at was the exact half hour that would let him keep all of it, the mother, the girl, the marriage, the children he didn't have yet and would. He would step off the train in the valley 2 hours late and run to his mother on the platform, and never once think that the lateness was the gift. There was a railroad widow in the 3rd car, traveling on a pass, going to nurse a sick sister, and that one, of all of them, might have understood. Because her own husband had died on the rails, and she knew what the mountain could do. There were 2 cattle buyers playing cards in the smoker. A young couple just married, riding to a new start in a new town. A doctor going to a patient. A girl of 17 going to her first job in the city with a cardboard suitcase and her heart in her throat. There was a man in the parlor car who was somebody. In the way the world counts, somebody, a banker, traveling with money and importance and the deep joke of the night. The thing Augusta would have smiled at if she'd had breath to spare for smiling was that her hands out in the cold were holding the banker's life exactly as carefully as they were holding Della's and the soldiers and the school teachers. No more and no less. Because the brake line does not know who is riding behind it, and the woman bleeding the brake line did not care. She was not saving the important ones. She was saving the train. She had never once, in 43 years, asked who was riding before she decided whether to stand at the valve and hear the water. That was the whole of what made her what she was, and the whole of what Pierce Holloway, holding the lantern in the cold, was only now beginning to understand. That the old woman he'd ranked beneath everyone had been, all along, the one person on the train who treated every life on it as worth the same cold half hour, the same frozen hands, the same standing of her ground. A train is a strange and democratic thing in the dark. The banker and the broke young mother ride the same rails over the same gorge, held back by the same air in the same line. And the mountain makes no distinction. And neither does ice. And neither, on her best nights, does the person whose job is to keep them all from the gorge. The only one making distinctions that night had been the man with the badge, who had decided that the old woman in the railroad coat was lost baggage, and the schedule was worth more than her warning, and even he, now, out in the cold, holding her lantern, was unlearning it, one held valve at a time. Inside the cars, the half hour on the summit passed the way such half hours do, in small human ways that knew nothing of the gorge. In the rear coach, Della's little girl woke again and could not get back to sleep. And the railroad widow across the aisle, the one who had buried her own husband off the rails and knew, better than anyone in the car, what the night might have held, leaned over and told the child a story to settle her. A long, soft story about a train that climbed a mountain so high it touched the stars, while the child's mother dozed at last, worn through, and the boy slept on with his head in her lap. The widow did not know there had been any danger. She told the story only because a child was awake and afraid of the storm, and because telling stories to other people's frightened children on night trains was the kind of small mercy that had kept her own heart from going hard after her husband died. She would never know that while she told it, an old woman she would never meet was out in the blizzard, making certain the train in her story would come down the mountain instead of into the gorge. 2 cars forward, the young soldier, Amos, gave up on sleep and went out to the vestibule for air, and found the brakeman Dunmore there, come in from helping at the rear, stamping the cold out of his boots. "Why are we stopped so long on the top?" "In this?" Amos asked, the way the young ask. "I'm patient." And Dunmore, who had just watched an old woman face down a conductor and bleed a frozen line by hand, looked at the boy in his uniform going home to whoever he was going home to, and said only, "Brakes. Old gal back there's making sure they'll hold us down the far side. Worth the half hour. Son, believe me, worth a lot more than the half hour." And the soldier, who did not understand and did not need to, shrugged and looked out at the storm and thought about his mother's face on the platform. And Dunmore looked at him a moment longer at one of the dozens of lives strung out down the train that an old woman's stubbornness was holding back from the gorge, and felt something he didn't have a word for, and went to find coffee. This is the thing about the people whose hands hold the rest of us up. Their work is invisible precisely when it succeeds. The story the widow told the child, the half hour the soldier resented, the sleep of the school teacher and the broke young mother, all of it was built on a foundation none of them could see. And the better Augusta did her job, the less any of them would ever know she had done it at all. A wreck announces itself forever. A wreck prevented announces nothing. The whole reward of the work is a carful of people telling each other stories and resenting the delay and sleeping through the storm, never knowing, never needing to know, that any of it was ever in doubt. That is not a tragedy. That is the job working exactly as it should. The grief is only that the world, having been held up all its life by such hands, so rarely troubles to learn they are there until the night they aren't. When the rear line ran clean and dry, and Augusta had walked the last 3 cars one more time, cracking a valve at each, and hearing nothing but the hard, dry hiss of honest air. She climbed back aboard and went forward to the head end herself. She would not phone it. Not tonight, and told the engineer. An old hand named Royce, who had run the mountain almost as long as she'd tended it. That the rear was bled and thawed and dry, and the train was hers to take down. Royce, who had worked with Augusta 30 years and had been one of the men who said, "You didn't take the grade on brakes," she'd flagged, only nodded and said, "If you say she'll hold, Gussie, she'll hold," and reached for the throttle and the brake. And that was the whole of his questioning. Because that was what her word was worth to the men who actually knew the mountain. There was a thing in that exchange, small and easy to miss. That was the whole quiet argument of the night made flesh. Royce was the engineer, the man whose hand was actually on the brake, whose skill brought the train down, as close to the top of the train crew's craft as you could stand. And Royce, who knew more about running a train than Pierce Holloway would learn in 20 years, did not question Augusta for 1 second, did not ask her twice, did not weigh her word against his schedule, because Royce was good enough at the actual work to know exactly what she was and exactly what her word was worth. It is a thing you see again and again. If you look, that the people at the true top of a craft and the people the institution ranks at the bottom often understand each other perfectly, recognize each other instantly, because both of them live in the world of the actual work where the truth is not negotiable, and that the contempt, the lost baggage contempt, comes most often not from the top or the bottom, but from the anxious middle, from the Pierce Holloways, with just enough rank to feel they must defend it, and not enough mastery to know what is actually beneath them and what is holding them up. Royce knew. Royce had always known. He reached for the brake on Gussie's word, the way you trust the floor, and brought 200 tons of train and 1,000 sleeping trusts down a mountain on the strength of an old woman's hands, and thought nothing of it, because to a man who truly knew the work, it was the most obvious thing in the world. And then the train started down. She had walked forward to the head end through the whole length of the train to tell Royce herself. And that walk, too, was its own small sermon, though no one saw it as one. She went car by car up the sleeping train past Della and her 2 children, sound asleep again, the boy's head still in his mother's lap, past the schoolteacher under his hat, past the soldier finally dozing with his face to the cold glass, past the widow who had told the bedtime story, asleep now herself, past the card players gone quiet, the newlyweds, the girl with the cardboard suitcase, the banker, the whole warm, trusting trainload of them. Not one awake to see the old woman in the railroad coat pass through with her lantern, going to give the word that would carry them all down the mountain. She looked at them as she went, the way she always did. Not sentimentally, just taking the count of them. The load, the souls, because that was the thing she had never once let herself forget in 43 years. That the brakes were not an abstraction and the grade was not a number on a schedule, but these people, exactly these, sleeping and trusting, who would live or not live by whether the line was honest. She had bled the line for them. She would give the word for them, and they would never know her name. She passed through them all and out the head end to Royce, and gave him the word. And not one of them stirred. A train coming down a long mountain grade does not race down and brake to a stop at the bottom. Do that, and the brakes overheat and fade and fail. And then you have a runaway made by the very braking meant to prevent it. It comes down, held the engineer, setting the air to hold a steady, safe speed against the pull of the grade, easing it on and off. Working with the long mechanical patience of a man riding a great weight down a mountain on compressed air. And it is in this long, controlled descent that a frozen rear line shows itself. Because the cars that cannot brake begin to push, and the engineer feels the train start to gain against his brakes, and knows, in a cold instant, that something behind him is not holding. That was the moment Augusta had been bleeding the line to prevent the moment. On the curve above the gorge, when Royce would call for the brakes and find out whether the whole train answered or only the front of it, she did not ride it out in a coach. She rode the descent out on the rear platform of the last car, in the cold and the storm, with her lantern and her hand near the manual handbrake. Because that was where the danger lived, and that was where she had ridden every dangerous descent for 43 years at the back. At the weekend, where she could feel the rear of the train do whatever it was going to do and throw the handbrakes herself if it came to that. Pierce Holloway, who an hour before had told her to take her hand off that brake wheel, rode it out beside her, in the cold, because he had asked to and because she had let him. And because a man who has just learned what he nearly did wants to be where the truth is, not where the warmth is. The train came down into the grade. The curves began. The long, sweeping curves cut into the mountainside above the black drop of the gorge. The same curves where the lanterns had gone down into the dark 40 years before. Royce set the air, and all through the train, in every car, the brakes took hold, all of them, front to back, the rear 3 included. The line Augusta had thawed, carrying the air clean to the last reservoir on the last car. The brakes she had made, honest biting steady against the wheels. The train held. There was one moment, on the steepest of the curves above the gorge, where Augusta's heart climbed into her throat, where she felt, or thought she felt, the train gain a little, the speed creep up as the grade steepened. And for one long black second, every nerve in her body went back 40 years to the lanterns going down the rocks. On the rear platform, she gripped the handbrake wheel and waited to feel the rear start to push. The dead weight shove that would mean the ice had beaten her after all. Beside her, Pierce felt her go still and went still himself, not understanding, only knowing that the woman who knew had stopped breathing. And then, up at the head end, Royce eased the air on a little heavier the way a master of the grade does. And the brakes answered all of them, the rear included. The honest dry line carrying the command clean to the back of the train, and the train settled back to its steady held pace. No push, no gain. The weight properly mastered, and Augusta let her breath out slow into the storm. It had not been the ice. It had only been the grade steepening, and brakes that held, doing exactly what brakes that hold are supposed to do. But for 1 second, she had been 28 again at the door of the shack. And she would not have been Augusta Lyle if she hadn't been. Because the ones who never feel that second are the ones who crack the valve and close it back and go get warm. The fear was the other face of the care. They came together or not at all. It came down the grade at the slow, safe pace of a great weight properly controlled. The cars holding their own and pushing nothing. And on the rear platform, Augusta felt through her feet and her hands, the thing she had bled the line, all that cold half hour to feel, the rear of the train holding, breaking true. No push, no gain. No slow, sick start of weight beginning to win. The brakes held on the curve above the gorge. They held all the way down. The passengers felt nothing but a long, smooth, slightly slow descent of a train coming carefully down a mountain in a storm. That was the whole point. That was the entire and perfect point of 43 years and one frozen half hour on the summit, that the people in the warm cars felt nothing, knew nothing, were never for one instant aware that the night had had a gorge in it. Della's children slept the whole way down. The soldier watched the lights of the valley come up out of the dark and thought of his mother. The schoolteacher dreamed. The banker read his papers. And the train came down the mountain whole, every car of it, every soul, and ran out onto the level of the valley and rolled on toward the city with the storm easing behind it on the heights. And not one passenger ever knew that an old woman had ridden the rear platform the whole way down in the cold with her hand near the handbrake, watching the gorge go by below them in the dark, making sure of it herself, the way she'd told the little girl she would. At the bottom of the grade, where the line leveled and the danger was past, Augusta let out the breath she had been holding down the whole mountain. And her legs, now that they could, shook a little under her. And Pierce Holloway saw it and put a hand under her elbow, not to help the old woman. Or not only that, but the way you steady someone you have come, in the space of one descent. To understand, you owe everything to. It held, he said, stupidly, because there was nothing else to say. It held. Augusta agreed. It was always going to hold. Once the water was out of it, that was never the question. She looked out at the gorge falling away behind them, black and bottomless in the storm. The question was whether anybody with the badge would listen long enough to let me get the water out. That's the only question there ever is. Mr. Holloway, the brakes are easy. The brakes are just physics. It's the listening that's hard. At the foot of the grade, where the line ran out level into the valley and the danger was wholly past, the train slowed for the water stop, and the head-end crew gathered a moment on the platform between cars in the easing storm. Royce, the engineer, Dunmore, the brakeman, Purnell, and Augusta, and Pierce among them. Now, in a way, he had not been at the top of the mountain. No longer above them, but among them. A man who had been somewhere with these people and come back changed. Nobody made a speech. Railroaders don't. Royce filled his pipe and got it lit against the wind and said only, to nobody in particular, brakes held nice all the way down, which from Royce was an oration. And Dunmore grunted. And that was the entire ceremony of it, a trainful of lives saved, and 4 words about the brakes holding nice. But Purnell looked at Augusta in the platform light, at the old woman leaning tired against the car with her ruined hands jammed in her coat pockets, and then at the conductor standing quiet among them. And the young man understood that he had watched something that night he would spend his life trying to live up to, not the brakes, not even the bleeding of the line, but the moment a man with a badge had chosen, at the last, to be among the people who make sure instead of merely above them. That was the thing worth learning. The brakes, you could teach anyone with patience. That other thing, the listening, the climbing down off your rank in the cold to where the truth lived, that was the rare thing. And Purnell meant to learn it too. And did. The train pulled out from the water stop and ran the last miles down into the valley city. And the storm fell away behind on the heights. And the windows of the cars glowed warm and yellow as the express came in 2 hours late and entirely whole. 2 hours late and entirely whole. And if you had stood on that platform and watched it come in, you would have seen only a late train and grumbled at the lateness, and never once guessed that the lateness was the whole gift. The half hour on the summit made flesh. The difference between a train that came home and a column of lanterns going down into the gorge. The most important things that happen are so often the things that visibly don't. The wreck that didn't. The fall that didn't. The gorge that stayed empty. A late train is what a saved train looks like from the platform. Learn to see it. Learn to bless the delay and wonder who earned it for you in the cold. The train came into the Valley City 2 hours late, and the passengers stepped off into the cold, clear after-storm night and went to their lives. The soldier ran to his mother on the platform. The broke young mother gathered her 2 sleeping children and her cardboard suitcases and went to find her own mother's house. The schoolteacher walked off toward his brother's funeral. The banker took a cab, and not one of them. Not one. Paused to wonder why the express had been late. Because being 2 hours late is a small, ordinary grievance, and being alive is a thing you don't notice you've been given. That is the wage of the people whose hands hold the rest of us up. They are not thanked. Because the disaster they prevented leaves no mark. And you cannot thank someone for a wreck that didn't happen when you never knew the wreck was coming. Augusta had made her peace with that wage 43 years before. At the door of a shack at the summit, watching lanterns go down into a gorge. She did not do it to be thanked. She did it so the lanterns would not go down again. She went home that morning to the small valley apartment she kept near the terminal. And her daughter Roberta was there, Roberta. 43 years old now. The baby who'd slept in a basket in the warming room while her mother learned the brakes. Grown into a school teacher herself, with children of her own, who had come to stay the night with her mother on the nights Augusta worked. The express because she worried. Every storm. The way the families of railroaders learn to worry. Roberta had the coffee on. And she took one look at her mother's face and her frost-cracked hands coming through the door and knew, the way you know with your own, that the night had been one of the bad ones. Mama, what happened? Your hands. Bled a rear line on the summit in the cold. Augusta said, easing down into the kitchen chair, letting her daughter take her hands and chafe the cold out of them. Long story. The train came down fine. The train came down fine. Roberta repeated, in the flat voice of a woman who has heard her mother say that exact sentence too many times, each time meaning a thing she would not fully tell. Mama, you're 68. Your hands are split open. You bled a line on the summit. In a blizzard. In this. She held her mother's ruined hands in both of hers. The same gesture, though neither of them thought of it, that Eckford Calloway had once used to take young Augusta's hands off a valve. How long are you going to keep going out on that mountain? The railroad would let you go tomorrow and never look back. Come stay here. The children would have their grandmother. You could be warm? And Augusta looked at her daughter at the baby from the basket. Grown and worried and right. Mostly right. And said the thing she had been saying for 3 years. Except that tonight, for the first time, she heard a different end to it coming. Soon. Berta, let me train the young one up first. There's a boy on the cars. Purnell. Asks the right questions. Wants to know the brakes the way I wanted to know them. Let me get him to where he can stand at the valve and hear the water. So there's somebody on that mountain who'll do it right after me. And then she stopped and looked at her cracked hands in her daughter's, and the lanterns going down the gorge were in her mind. And so, now, was the rear line holding all the way down. And so was a 6-year-old in a too big coat asking if the train was broke. And then, I'll come be warm. I think I can come be warm soon. Berta, I think tonight I finally got something I've been waiting 43 years for. And I didn't even know I was waiting for it. What's that? Roberta asked. A man with the badge. Augusta said, stood out in the cold, and held my lantern. And she could not, for a moment, say any more than that. And Roberta did not understand it the way her mother meant it. But she understood that her mother was weeping a little, which she had almost never seen. And she held her mother's hands and let her. And outside the window the storm had blown through, and the valley was coming up cold and clear, and the trains were running, held back on every grade by hands like her mother's that nobody would ever thank. Later that morning, Roberta's youngest, a boy of 7, climbed up onto his grandmother's lap at the kitchen table and asked her the question children ask, which is, what do you do? What is it you actually do up on that mountain all night? And Augusta thought about how to answer a 7-year-old, and what she finally said was, "I make sure the train can stop." The boy considered this with the seriousness of the young and found it wanting. It did not sound like much. Next to driving the train or blowing the whistle, and asked,
"Is that important?" And Augusta pulled him in close.
This child of the child, from the basket, and said, "Baby, it's the most important thing there is. Anybody can make a thing go. It takes somebody who loves the people on it to make sure it can stop." And the boy didn't understand it. Not really. Not for years, but he remembered it. The way children remember the things said to them, with the whole weight of a life behind them. And when he was grown, he understood it. And he told it to his own children. And so the thing Eckford Calloway had said in the cold to a young widow went down through her and through her daughter's house and on into a future Augusta would never see. Which is the only kind of forever any of us really gets. Pierce Holloway, for his part, did not sleep that morning. He sat in a railroad hotel near the terminal with the conductor's pouch on the table in front of him and the on-time sheet inside it that he had been so afraid of. And he understood, in the gray light, that he had a choice to make of exactly the kind that decides what a man is. He could bury it. No one had died. A train held half an hour on a summit. A rear line bled. An express brought in 2 hours late behind a blizzard. There was nothing in any of it that required Pierce Holloway to ever tell the division a single word about how he had called his car attendant, lost baggage, and threatened to fire her on the grade and very nearly taken a train full of sleeping people down onto the curve above the gorge on a frozen line. He could write delayed by weather. Summit stop for brake servicing per inspector, which was even true as far as it went, and let the lateness be the whole story. And go on being the young conductor with the good on-time record and the way with the parlor car passengers. On his way up, the only witnesses who could contradict a cleaner version were a brakeman and an engineer and a car attendant. Crew. The kind of people a division does not ask twice when a conductor's report is clean. He could make the whole night disappear into a single defensible line. And no one would ever know. And he would rise. Instead, he wrote the truth. All of it. He wrote a report to the division superintendent that did not spare himself one word, that said he had been running late and afraid for his on-time record, and had decided the senior car attendant's warning was the obsolete caution of a woman whose kind of railroading was finished. He wrote that Augusta Lyle had bled the rear reservoirs on the climb, found water in the line, and warned that the rear brakes would freeze and the train would lose them on the grade above the gorge, and that he had refused her by phone and then, when she walked the whole length of the train forward to tell him to his face, had called her lost baggage and a relic and dead weight, and threatened to put her off the division. He wrote that the only reason there was a trainload of passengers who had walked off at the Valley Terminal that morning, instead of a column of lanterns going down into the gorge, was that this woman he had threatened to fire had refused to be fired, had stood her ground in the vestibule, and had then bled and thawed and dried a frozen rear airline by hand on the summit in a blizzard, a thing no signed terminal inspection and no schedule and no on-time sheet would ever have caught in time. A thing only 43 years of knowing that mountains breaks could have done. He wrote that he had been wrong in every way a man can be wrong, and that he had nearly become, in his first season with the badge, the conductor who took a train full of people into the gorge because he would not listen to the car attendant. And he wrote one thing more, which cost him the most, because it was the thing that could not be unwritten. He recommended, in his own report, in his own hand, that Augusta Lyle's standing be made what it had been in the old days, that the senior brake inspector's call to hold a train for the brakes be binding on the conductor, never again to be overridden for the sake of a schedule. The way the old conductors had honored it by trust and the new railroad had let die, He recommended that the railroad stop trying to cut her position and the positions like it. And he set down in writing, where the division and the accountants and his own superiors would read it. The plain fact that the on-time sheet they were all so afraid of was worth exactly nothing measured against one frozen rear line and one stubborn old woman. And that a railroad that forgot that would, sooner or later, send a train into a gorge to make its schedule. He signed it and sent it up the line, knowing it put a black mark on his own record in his first season, knowing it might cost him the better runs and the rise he'd been chasing, knowing the division might well decide that a conductor who writes a report like that against himself is a conductor who lacks the hardness they wanted. He sent it anyway, because some things should cost the person they should cost. And he had decided, somewhere out on the rear platform, riding the gorge down in the cold beside the woman he'd called lost baggage, that he would rather be a man who told the truth and paid for it than a man who took a train full of people to the edge of the gorge and wrote it up clean. That's the part that makes it a story instead of just a near miss. It did cost him. The division did not love a conductor who wrote a report like that against himself. And the better runs he'd been angling for went to other men for a while. And there were those in the front office who said quietly that Holloway had lost his nerve. Gone soft. Let an old carwoman get in his head. He bore it. And something in him had changed too deep to change back not into a saint. Because that is not how people work. He was still ambitious. Still capable of impatience. Still a man who liked the on-time sheet to read clean. But he had learned the one thing on that mountain that the badge had never taught him. And it had gone into him for good. That the schedule was made of people, and the people were held up by other people he had been trained not to see. And that the most dangerous moment in his work was always the moment he was most certain he could see the whole of a thing. From his warm seat, he took to walking the cars in the cold himself. After that, on the hard nights, not because he could read the brakes, he never would, but to stand where the truth was and to know the names of the people whose hands held his train up. He learned Purnell's name. He learned the names of the men in the railroad coats he'd have called crew the season before. And years later, when he had risen after all for the railroad, in time, came to value a man who told it the truth. It didn't want the way railroads learn such things the hard way after near misses. He was known on the mountain division as the conductor who held the train, the one who'd back an inspector's call against any schedule. And the old heads said of him, in the way they passed such things along, that Holloway had been a fool his first season and then had become, the rest of his life, a man you could trust on the grade, which is the most any of us can hope to be. A fool who was lucky enough to be corrected in time, and humble enough to stay corrected. What came after did not happen the way the pictures would do it. There was no medal pinned on Augusta in the terminal rotunda. No railroad president stepping off a private car to shake her ruined hand before the newspapers. No slow clap from a grateful crowd. The division read Pierce Holloway's report, and there was a quiet investigation. And the kind of thing happened that happens in real institutions when an honest report lands on the right desk at the right moment, which is to say, slowly and incompletely and mixed with self-protection. But it happened. The railroad, which it also just understood, reading between the lines of that report, how close its own cost-cutting and schedule chasing had come to putting a passenger train into the gorge and the railroad's name into a kind of headline that ends railroads, did several things. It quietly shelved the plan to cut the senior brake inspector positions on the mountain division. It issued a new instruction to the mountain conductors that the senior car inspector's call to hold a train for the brakes was binding, and that no conductor would be faulted on his on-time record for a delay taken on the inspector's word. restoring by written rule the standing the old conductors had given the inspector by trust, and the new railroad had nearly thrown away to save a few minutes a run. It ordered the rear airlines on the winter mountain trains fitted with better drains, and the reservoirs bled on a stricter schedule in hard cold. The exact failure no one in an office had thought hard enough about until a near runaway made them. And here is a thing that is true of such changes, and worth saying, because it is the part that outlasts everybody in the story. The new drains and the stricter bleeding schedule and the written rule binding the conductor to the inspector's call did not save one train. They saved trains nobody ever counted. For years. For decades. Winter after winter of rear lines that did not freeze because they were drained right. Of conductors who held at the summit because the rule now said they must. Of crews and passengers who came down the mountain whole and never knew that they owed it. Distantly, to a blizzard night, and an old woman in a vestibule, and a young conductor who told the truth on himself. That is how the good that people like Augusta do actually travels through the world, not in medals or headlines, but in rules and habits and trained hands, in the quiet machinery of how things get done after passed down and built in until nobody remembers where it came from. Somewhere, years later, a child slept through a winter descent on a mountain train and grew up and lived a whole life. And the reason traced back, through a chain no one could see, to Augusta Lyle's hands on a frozen valve on a night that child's parents were not even born for. The water gathers in the line on every cold climb. Forever. The only question, forever, is whether somebody built the thing, or trained the hands, or wrote the rule that makes sure it gets bled before the grade. Augusta spent her life being that somebody, and then she made sure there would be others, and that not the one train, but the unbroken line of trains coming down safe after her was the real shape of what she did. And it did the thing that mattered most to Augusta. Though it had nothing to do with her wages or any medal, it asked her, before she took the pension she'd been putting off for 3 years, to spend her last season training the next generation of brake inspectors on the mountain division to pass on, while there was still time, what 43 winners on that grade had put into her hands, and Augusta, who could have taken the pension that spring and gone to be warm in her daughter's house with her grandchildren, said yes, and spent her last season walking the cold cars in the dark with crews a third her age, teaching them the things no signed inspection holds, how to crack a valve and stand there and let it run and hear the water under the air, how the rear of a train runs coldest and freezes first, how the climb and the cold change everything that was signed off warm and dry in the valley, how to read a brake system with your hands and your ears the way the gauges never will. She taught them to walk the whole train end to end on every hard climb and every hard cold, no matter what the schedule said, and to stand in the vestibule and say, "Hold the train," even when a man with a watch and a badge called them lost baggage and told them to tend their stoves and be quiet. She taught them, above all, the thing Eckford Calloway had taught her, the thing that was the whole job under all the other jobs, that a train going down a mountain is a falling weight held back by nothing but air, and the people who keep the air honest, and the lives of a whole train of souls who will never learn the inspector's name, are riding on whether somebody stood at the valve long enough to hear the water. Every single climb, no matter who's wearing the brass. And the one she taught above all the others was Purnell, the young attendant who had come back through the storm with her tools and torch and held the line while she thought it. The one man on the cars who'd asked the questions the others didn't bother to ask, who wanted now to earn his own inspector's standing and learn the mountain the way she knew it. Purnell was 30, with a young family of his own down in the valley. And he had come to the railroad the way Augusta had needing the work, taking what they'd give him, which for a young black man was a porter's coat and a broom, and the understanding that the running gear was not for the likes of him. But he had watched Augusta the way she had once watched Eckford Calloway, his eyes following her hands. And he had started asking her things in the quiet hours. And she had started, in small ways, to answer, because she had been waiting a long time without quite knowing it for someone to ask. The blizzard night had decided it. A man who would come back through a storm to hold a torch for an old woman, everyone else called lost baggage, was a man who understood. In his bones already. What the work was for. And Purnell understood something else too. Something that made him want it badly. That to hold the inspector standing was to be the one person on the train whose word could stop a man with a badge to be. For the people in the cars. The thing that stood between them and the gorge. Regardless of what coat the railroad made you wear, or what names the conductors called you, he had a daughter. He thought about the mother and the 2 children in the rear coach that night. And he thought about his own girl. And he wanted to be the one out on the running boards in the cold, making sure that is the only reason worth wanting it for. And Augusta had seen it in him. And so she taught him everything. Augusta spent her last season teaching Purnell the whole of it. The 2 of them out on the cold running boards in the dark before the climbs. And on her last night, on the mountain, before she hung up her lantern and went down to be warm in her daughter's house for good. She did the thing Eckford Calloway had once done for her. Eckford Calloway. On the day he had finally left the mountain, an old man by then. His lungs going. His hands at last too stiff to trust on the valves had given young Augusta the one thing he had carried his whole working life. A brake inspector's gauge and a small brass-cased railroad watch. The gauge for reading the air and the watch for timing what could only be timed by a person who knew what true looked like. The watch was the one Augusta had carried in her coat for 43 years. The one she'd timed 10,000 brake tests against. The one in her pocket, the night Pierce Holloway called her lost baggage. And when Eckford had pressed them into her young hands, he had said the thing that ran like a rail down the whole length of her life. These aren't for telling you the pressure and the hour. Daughter, the cab's got gauges and every man's got a watch. These are for backing up your own hands and your own ears when a man with a badge tells you you're wrong and tells you what you are. Because you're going to spend your whole life out here in the cold and the dark where nobody can see you. And every train that comes down this mountain safe is going to come down because you stood at the valve and heard the water. And not one soul aboard is ever going to climb down here and learn your name. They'll ride down warm and step off at the bottom and go to their lives and never think of you once. And you're going to be tempted. Some bitter night when your hands are split and the badge is calling you names and the warm car is right there. To think that because nobody sees you, it doesn't matter to crack the valve and listen for a second and close it back and go get warm and let the next person worry about the grade. Don't you ever, daughter. You stand there and you let it run and you hear what's really in the line. And you tell the truth about it even when the badge won't hear it. Even when they call you everything but a child of God. Because a whole train of people who'll never know your name are trusting their lives to whether you bothered to hear the water. They'll run out of names before you run out of trains that came down safe. That's the answer. That's the only answer that ever shuts them up. Be that answer. Daughter. Be it so many times they run out of names to call you. The mountain will know. The trains will come down. That's the whole of it. That's the job. Augusta had carried that watch and that gauge for 43 years. She had stood at the valve and heard the water 10,000 times. And on the blizzard night this story is about, it was that watch in her coat when she walked the length of the train forward to face a man who called her lost baggage. And it was that gauge in her hand and that lesson in her bones when she bled and thawed the rear line on the summit so a train full of sleeping people could come down the mountain hole, so that a broke young mother and her 2 children could reach the grandmother's house, and a soldier could run to his mother on the platform. And a 6-year-old in a too big coat could grow up never knowing there had been a gorge in the night at all, and never quite know, the way none of us ever quite know, whose split and frozen hands in the dark had stood at the valve and heard the water and held the whole falling weight of the train back from the edge. On her last night on the mountain, she pressed the watch and the gauge into Purnell's hands, the way you hand a person a thing you mean for them to keep, and she told him, closing his fingers around them, what Eckford had told her, that they were for backing up his own hands when the badge said he was wrong, that he'd spend his life unseen and unthanked, and that on the night the line ran wet and the badge said, "Take the grade," he was to stand at the valve and hear the water and say, "Hold the train," out loud, no matter what they called him. They'll run out of names, she told him. Before you run out of trains that came down safe, be the answer, son. Be it so many times they run out of names. And then she went down the mountain for the last time, into the valley. To be varm, she did get to be warm. In the end, she took the spare room in Roberta's house, and her grandchildren learned the weight and the comfort of a grandmother always there. And she sat on the porch in the evenings, the way her daughter had begged her to for years. And her split hands slowly healed, as much as 43 years of frozen iron will ever let hands heal. She did not talk much about the mountain. People who have done that kind of work rarely do. But sometimes, on a hard, cold night, when the wind came down off the heights and rattled the valley windows, Roberta would find her mother awake at the window, looking up toward the dark shape of the pass, and would understand that her mother was thinking of the lines freezing up there in the cold and of whether somebody was out on the running boards making the trains honest, and Roberta learned not to tell her to come away from the window, but to bring her a cup of coffee and stand with her a while. The two of them looking up at the mountain together, the baby from the basket grown gray herself now, keeping her mother company in the old vigil that would not quite let her go. And there came a night, 2 winters after Augusta left the mountain, when a letter reached her in the valley. Written in a careful hand, she knew Purnell's. He had earned his inspector's standing, and he wrote to tell her, because he thought she would want to know, and because he had no one else who would understand, that he had walked a train on a hard, cold climb the week before and found water in a rear line, and that the conductor, a new young man, in a hurry, with a schedule to make, had told him to log it and tend his work, and had called him a name, and that he, Purnell, had stood in the vestibule with Eckford Calloway's gauge in his hand and Augusta Lyle's voice in his memory, and had said, "Hold the train," and had held it, and bled the line, and brought the train down safe, and that the passengers had slept through all of it and would never know. I stood at the valve and let it run and heard the water, like you taught me, he wrote, and I said it out loud, even though he called me what he called me. And the train came down safe. You were right. They run out of names before you run out of trains. Augusta read the letter twice, sitting on her daughter's porch in the cold, clear evening, and then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket, next to where the watch used to ride for 43 years. And she looked up at the mountain, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely at peace, because that was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. Not the medal she never got, not the thanks the passengers never knew to give, not the badge she never wore. Just this, that the thing Eckford Calloway had put into her hands in the cold and the dark, she had put into another's, and it would go on after her. Out on the running boards, in the storms she would never see, keeping the trains coming down safe and the people sleeping through it. For as long as there were mountains and cold, and somebody willing to stand at the valve and hear the water and tell the truth, the work was invisible, The work was unthanked. The work went on. That was the answer. And it was enough. And it had always been enough. This story is invented. There is no Night Express, and no Pierce Holloway, and no Augusta Lyle bleeding a frozen line on a summit in the dark. No Eckford Calloway. No lanterns going down into a gorge. None of these people ever lived. And the mountain they crossed is not on any map, but you already know the real part. Don't you? You know it the way you know cold. You know what it is to be looked at and sorted in a single glance by the uniform. The wrench. The unglamorous post. The coal scoop they handed you out of pity. The salary they keep eyeing to cut. The kind of work they're sure anyone could do, or a machine could replace, by someone who decided exactly what you were worth before they ever found out the first true thing about what you knew. You know what it is to carry, in your own two hands, the precise knowledge that would keep everyone safe. And to watch a person with a badge and a schedule and a great deal of certainty wave that knowledge away and tell you to tend your stoves and mind your place. That part isn't invented. That part happens on trains and shop floors and job sites and in back offices and hospital corridors and every other place where the people who actually know how the thing works are ranked beneath the people who merely run it. Happens every single night. To people holding exactly the warning that would save everyone, while the ones with the watches tell them to log it and be quiet. Somewhere right now, in the cold, at the back of something. A person who knows precisely which line is freezing is being called lost baggage and told to keep their warning to themselves. Maybe you have been that person. Most of us have been, at one time or another, the one who saw the thing, who knew the thing, who tried to say the thing, and was waved off by someone too certain of their own rank to hear it. You know the particular cold of it, not the danger itself. But the loneliness of being right, where being right counts for nothing. Of carrying a truth that could save everyone and being told by the badge that you are nothing. That your truth is a feeling. That you should tend your stoves. And maybe this is the harder thing to sit with. You have also been the other one. Maybe you have been Pierce. More times than you'd like to count. Snapping your watch open and shut. So sure of your schedule and your standing that you waved off the person in the cold who was only trying to keep you off the rocks. Most of us have been that one too. The whole terrible commonness of these nights is that there is a Pierce and an Augusta in nearly every room where something can go wrong. And which one we are on any given night is not fixed by our character, but chosen again and again. In the small moment when someone beneath our notice says, wait. And I want to leave you with the version of the lesson that costs something, because the easy version is everywhere, and it is a lie that comforts. The easy version is, be kind to everyone. You never know who someone really is. They might be important. But that is not the lesson. And it is a quiet kind of cowardice dressed up as wisdom, because it still makes a person's worth wait on a reveal. It still says, be careful how you treat the help. Because the help might turn out to be somebody, Augusta never turned out to be somebody. There was no private car at the rear. No famous name. No hidden fortune. No inspector general stepping off at the summit to put the conductor in his place. She was a black woman in a railroad coat with a wrench on her belt and split hands and a coal scoop in her past. Exactly what Pierce Holloway took her for. At a glance, and she was, at the very same time, the most important person on that entire mountain. The one person between a trainful of sleeping souls and the gorge. And those two things were never in any tension at all. She was lost baggage to Pierce when she warned him. And she was lost baggage to Pierce while she stood at the valve and heard the water. And her knowing how to save that train never depended for 1 second on her turning out to be anyone other than the old car attendant she appeared to be. That is the harder lesson. And it is the true one. The worth was already there. It did not wait for anyone's permission to exist. And it did not need a reveal to become real. It was already there. Out in the cold and the dark at the back of the train. In the person you had already decided was beneath you. Listening fully there. The whole time. While you were still deciding she was lost baggage. The cracked wheel rings dead, whether or not you respect the woman holding the hammer. The water freezes in the line, whether or not the inspector who found it has a title you'd bow to. Reality does not check anyone's rank before it kills them. And it does not check anyone's rank before it spares them either. It only asks whether somebody who knew the truth was listened to in time. The test of a person was never whether they would heed the stranger who turned out to be a king. Anyone heeds a king once the crown comes out. The test, the only test that has ever measured what a person actually is whether they will heed the car attendant in the cold, on the strength of nothing but the truth in her hands, when there is no crown coming, when there is nothing in it at all but a train full of strangers asleep in the dark. Pierce Holloway nearly failed that test, the way most of us fail it, the way the schedule and the pride and the fear of looking weak make us fail it every day. And then, at the last possible mile before the summit, with a child's face in his mind and his brakeman against him, he passed it. Barely. Late. But he passed it. And a train came down a mountain hole. And that a proud man choosing, at the last second, to listen to the one he'd called dead weight is rarer and more precious than any reveal. Any crown, any private car, it is the whole of what we owe each other. And almost the whole of what we so seldom pay. So let me ask you, and I do want it in the comments, because I read them, and these are the answers that matter. Who in your life is the person everybody talks over? The one in the railroad coat? The one out on the cold running boards? The one whose whole job you think you understand perfectly well from your warm seat? Who actually knows, right now, exactly which line is freezing, and exactly how to keep everyone from the gorge. If only somebody with a badge would hold the train and listen, picture them. You know who they are. And the harder question? The one that costs something to answer honestly. When was the last time you were Pierce Holloway? When did you last stand there snapping your watch open and shut? So sure of your own schedule and your own rank, that you waved away the person in the cold who was trying to tell you the one thing that would have saved you and got lucky, the way Pierce got lucky, that the truth they carried held the train anyway, with no thanks from you? If this one reached you, don't just scroll on. Send it to somebody who runs a thing, who holds the watch, who wears the badge. Who decides who's a trainman and who's lost baggage? Who has the small and terrible power to wave a person off the division or hold the train? Remind them that the most important person on the whole mountain is very often the one they've already decided is only there to tend the stoves. And subscribe. If you want more of these, the quiet ones, the true ones. The ones where nobody turns out to be secretly rich and nobody gets a medal. Because most of us never do. And we matter anyway. Every single one of us. Exactly as much as the brake line cares. Which is to say, completely and without regard to whose name is on the pouch. Because in the end, the mountain does not care whose name is on the conductor's pouch. It never did. The grade does not care about the on-time sheet. And the ice does not care about the badge. And the gorge has never once asked, of the people it might have taken, what their rank was. The mountain asks only one question. The same question it has asked on every grade, on every cold night since the first train climbed the first pass. Did somebody who truly knew the brakes walk the cars in the cold and stand at the valve and hear the water and tell the truth about it? And did anyone with the power to hold the train listen in time? That is the only question that has ever mattered. And the answer? On the nights the trains come down safe, is always the same, and always invisible, and almost never thanked. Yes, somebody did. Somebody was out there in the dark at the back of the train, where you couldn't see them, with split and frozen hands, holding the whole falling weight of all of us back from the edge, so that the rest of us, every single one, every ordinary night, riding warm and asleep down out of mountains we never even knew were dangerous, carried the whole way by the unthanked care of people we never learned the names of, can come down the grade and pass the gorge and step off at the bottom into the cold, clear morning and go home. So learn their names. That is the whole of what this asks of you, and it is not small. Learn the names of the people in the railroad coats in your own life. The ones out in the cold at the back of whatever you ride, warm and asleep in the front of. Find out what they know. Hold their lantern once in a while. In the cold, where the truth is. Because one night, and you will not get to choose which night the train you are on, is going to start down a grade with ice in the line. And the only thing between you and the gorge is going to be whether somebody you were trained to call lost baggage walked the cars in the cold. And whether you, when they came to tell you, were the kind of person who listened, be that kind of person. Be it so many times, it becomes who you are. And then, on the night it matters, you will not have to find the courage. You will already be the one who holds the train. That is the whole of it. That is the job. Not the conductor's job, or the inspector's job, but the human one. The only one that finally counts. To be for the people who are trusting you. The one who makes sure.